Andy and Sarah Miller had never planned to move to the lake house. It was meant to be a summer retreat, a quiet getaway where their children, Jake and Sophie, could escape the noise of the city and enjoy the simple pleasures of swimming, fishing, and running barefoot along the shore. The house itself was an old family property passed down to Andy from his father, who had inherited it from his own parents decades earlier. Though it wasn't a luxurious place, it was rich with memories: summer barbecues, late-night bonfires, and lazy afternoons spent watching the water ripple under the golden sun. But when an unexpected layoff forced Andy to reconsider their living situation, the idea of permanently settling by the lake became more than just an idle thought. His architecture firm had downsized, and with 2 children to support, the rising costs of city life no longer made sense. Sarah, a freelance editor, could work from anywhere, and the lake house, with its fully paid-off mortgage and wide-open space, offered a chance to rebuild their lives in a way they had never considered before. The transition wasn't easy. There were endless repairs to make, schools to transfer the kids into, and the challenge of adapting to a small-town lifestyle. But within a few months, the Millers had settled in, learning to appreciate the peace that came with their new home. That peace, however, was short-lived. Across the lake, in a stately home perched on a slight hill, lived Karen Doyle. A woman in her late 60s, she had a reputation in the town for being both influential and insufferable, a relic of the town's old elite who carried herself as if she still dictated local affairs. Her late husband, Charles Doyle, had once been a prominent attorney, and though he had passed years ago, Karen still wielded the authority of his name like a weapon. Unlike Andy's home, which sat comfortably nestled against the shore, Karen's property had never extended to the water. Her land stopped short of the lake, separated by a narrow strip of public land that had always belonged to the township. But over the years, Karen had subtly rewritten that reality. Through sheer force of personality and relentless insistence, she had managed to make the community believe that the lake was, in some unofficial way, hers. She would correct newcomers who tried to fish near her dock, glare at teenagers who dared to wade too close to her side of the water, and if anyone questioned her. She had an arsenal of vague statements about historical property rights and old town agreements that no one ever had the patience to challenge. For years, this was never an issue. The lake was large, and most people respected invisible boundaries. But the Millers were different. Andy's family had actual rights to the lake. The legal documentation was clear. His property extended into the water itself, granting him ownership of a significant portion of the shoreline, including the very area Karen had been claiming as her own for years. When the Millers moved in, they didn't see an issue with letting their kids splash around freely, launching their canoe from the shore and skipping rocks across the water. To them, it was their home, their right. But to Karen, it was an intrusion. The first confrontation was almost comically minor. One warm afternoon, while Jake and Sophie played near the shore, Karen appeared at the water's edge, her perfectly styled blonde-gray hair catching the sunlight as she raised a manicured hand. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp but wrapped in a thin layer of politeness. "I'd appreciate it if you kept your children from crossing onto my side of the lake." Andy, who had been fixing part of the dock, turned his head. "They're not on your side," he replied casually. "This is our property." Karen's lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "Well," she said, adjusting the pearl necklace around her throat, "that may be, but I've lived here for over 30 years. And I can tell you that people around here respect the boundaries of the lake." Sarah, who had just stepped onto the dock with a glass of iced tea, frowned. "We are respecting the boundaries. We own this part of the lake." Karen let out a light, breathy laugh, the kind that masked deep irritation. "Oh dear," she said, "you might want to double-check those facts. You see, there's a bit of history here that I don't think you're aware of. It's always been understood that this side of the lake belongs to my property." Andy stood up, brushing off his hands. "I have the deed that says otherwise." For a brief moment, something flickered in Karen's eyes: annoyance, perhaps, or something darker. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same saccharine smile. "I see," she said smoothly. "Well, I suppose it's a matter of perspective." With that, she turned on her heel and walked back to her house. Andy and Sarah exchanged a glance. It was a weird, uncomfortable interaction, but they weren't the type to make a big deal out of small-town dramatics. They chalked it up to an eccentric old woman being territorial and left it at that. But in the coming days, they began to notice the small ways Karen made her displeasure known. First, it was the private property signs that appeared overnight, hammered into the dirt along the water's edge. Then came the phone calls, anonymous complaints to the township about noise disturbances. Coming from the Miller house, though they rarely played music outside, and their kids were hardly the rowdy type. One morning, Andy found a pile of dead fish dumped at the edge of their dock, the stench unbearable, the implication clear. And then, 1 week later, the police arrived. It was early evening when the cruiser rolled down the gravel driveway, its lights flashing but siren silent. Andy and Sarah were inside, finishing up dinner when the knock came at the door. Standing on the porch was a uniformed officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a neutral expression. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. Andy nodded, exchanging a glance with Sarah before stepping onto the porch. "That's me." The officer cleared his throat. "We got a call about a trespassing complaint. A Mrs. Karen Doyle stated that your children were playing in an area of the lake that she claims is her property." Andy felt his stomach tighten. "That's not possible. My family owns that part of the lake." The officer shifted slightly. "Do you have proof of that?" Andy didn't hesitate. "Yes, I have the deed, the property survey, everything." The officer nodded, looking slightly relieved. "All right, that's good to know. Listen, between you and me, Mrs. Doyle has a habit of filing these kinds of complaints. But she's also been in this town a long time, and she knows people. If she pushes this further, you might want to be prepared." Sarah crossed her arms. "Prepared for what?" The officer gave a small shrug. "Legal disputes, boundary claims, things that get tied up in bureaucracy." Andy exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had thought this was just a petty neighborhood squabble, an old woman clinging to a false sense of ownership. But now, hearing the warning laced in the officer's voice, he realized something else. Karen wasn't just making empty threats. She was playing a long game, and if they weren't careful, she might actually win. The morning after the police visit, Andy woke up with a deep sense of unease, the officer's warning replaying in his mind like a broken record. He had assumed that Karen's complaints were nothing more than the usual passive-aggressive antics of an entitled neighbor, but something about the way the officer had phrased his words made him rethink everything. If she had already started making official complaints, what else was she capable of? Sarah had been unusually quiet about the whole situation, but he could tell she was unsettled. She had always been good at maintaining a sense of calm in difficult situations, but Andy knew her well enough to see through the mask. She wasn't just annoyed, she was worried. Later that afternoon, while Sarah took the kids into town for groceries, Andy decided to go through his legal documents again. He retrieved the manila folder from the small home office they had set up in one of the spare bedrooms. Inside were all the records related to the lake house title deeds, old property surveys, tax assessments, and correspondence from when his father had handled the estate. He flipped through each paper carefully, double-checking every boundary line, every legal description, and every official stamp. The records were indisputable. His family had owned this land for over 70 years, and the legal boundaries were clear. Their property extended to the lake, and nothing in the documentation suggested that Karen had any claim to it. But if that was the case, why did she seem so confident? That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sarah finally broke the silence. "So what's the plan?" she asked, setting down her fork and looking directly at Andy. "She's not going to stop. We both know that." Andy sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. I mean, we have all the proof we need. The documents are solid. I just don't understand what she's trying to do here. She's trying to intimidate us, Sarah said bluntly. She's testing us, seeing how far she can push before we push back. Andy exhaled, leaning back in his chair. I just don't get how she thinks this will end. Does she think she can actually take the lake from us? That's not how property laws work. Sarah hesitated before responding. Maybe it's not about what's legal. Maybe it's about what she can make people believe. Andy frowned. What do you mean? Sarah tapped her fingers against the table, choosing her words carefully. She's lived here forever. She knows people. She's probably spent years telling everyone that the lake is hers, and now we're the outsiders proving her wrong. Maybe she's not trying to win in court. Maybe she's trying to win in public opinion first. The thought made Andy's stomach turn. He had seen how quickly rumors could turn into truth when repeated enough times. If Karen had spent years establishing herself as the rightful owner of the lake in the eyes of the community, then people might instinctively take her side regardless of what the law said. And if she had connections in local government, she could make life very difficult for them, even if they were technically in the right. A week later, the first sign that Sarah was right arrived in the form of a letter. It was from the County Land Management Office, informing them that a formal dispute had been filed regarding their property boundaries. The letter stated that while no legal action had been taken yet, the claim would be reviewed and further action might be required. Andy read it twice, gripping the paper tightly. You have got to be kidding me. Sarah took the letter from his hands, scanning it quickly. She really went through with it, she muttered. Andy shook his head, pacing the kitchen. This is ridiculous. We have the paperwork. We have the original surveys. She has nothing. That doesn't matter, Sarah said. Now we have to prove she has nothing. That takes time. And money. Andy ran a hand through his hair. We should get a lawyer. Sarah nodded. Agreed. But before we do that, I want to talk to someone. Andy looked at her curiously. Who? She set the letter down on the table and folded her arms. The town clerk. If Karen's been pulling strings, we need to know who's helping her. The next morning, Sarah drove into town alone while Andy stayed behind with the kids. The town clerk's office was a small brick building just off the main road, tucked between the library and a coffee shop. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, and the room was lined with metal filing cabinets that looked like they had been there since the 1970s. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her 50s with thick glasses and a skeptical expression, tapping away at a keyboard. Sarah approached with a polite but firm smile. Hi, I'm Sarah Miller. My husband and I recently moved into the lake house on the East Shore. I was hoping to look at any recent filings related to property disputes. The woman glanced up, eyeing Sarah for a long moment before nodding slowly. That'd be the Doyle complaint, she said, turning to one of the cabinets. We don't get a lot of those around here, but when Mrs. Doyle makes a request, we know to process it quickly. Sarah's stomach tightened. Why is that? The clerk chuckled dryly as she flipped through files. Because it's easier than arguing with her. She pulled out a thin folder and handed it over. Here you go. Standard dispute claim. Looks like she's trying to have the boundary line reevaluated based on some historical records. Sarah skimmed the document, her pulse quickening. The attached notes included references to old, unofficial maps that didn't match any of the legal surveys. There was also a list of people Karen had contacted for supporting evidence. Among them was a name Sarah didn't recognize, James Kessler, retired surveyor. She glanced back at the clerk. This Kessler guy, does he actually have any authority? The clerk shrugged. Used to work for the county decades ago. He's not official anymore, but people like him because he remembers how things used to be. Sarah felt a wave of frustration. Karen wasn't using legal arguments, she was using nostalgia, twisting the town's history to suit her own version of reality. When Sarah returned home, she wasted no time filling Andy in. She's using an old surveyor to push this claim. She's not even trying to prove anything legally, she's trying to create doubt. Andy clenched his jaw. So what do we do? Sarah took a deep breath. We fight back the right way. We get a real lawyer, one who specializes in land disputes, and we make sure she can't twist this any further. Andy nodded, already pulling up contacts on his phone. If she wants a war, she's got one. But before they could even make the first call, a loud banging sounded at the front door. Andy opened it to find Karen standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You made a mistake," she said coldly. Andy narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Karen smirked, her eyes glinting with something almost triumphant. "You didn't think I'd just let you take what's mine, did you?" Before Andy could respond, she handed him an envelope. "Consider this my formal notice," she said, turning on her heel. Andy ripped open the envelope and felt his blood run cold. It wasn't just another dispute claim. Karen was suing them for trespassing. Andy stood in the doorway, gripping the legal notice so tightly that the paper crumpled in his hands. He could feel his pulse hammering in his temples as he scanned the document, reading and rereading the words that confirmed what he had already suspected. Karen wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just some baseless complaint filed with the township or an angry outburst meant to intimidate them. She had gone straight to court. Sarah took the notice from his hands, her expression darkening as she read through it. "She's really doing this," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "She's actually suing us for trespassing on our own land." Andy felt a wave of frustration crash over him. "She knows damn well this isn't her property," he said, pacing back and forth on the porch. "She's just trying to drain us time, money, energy. She wants to make this so exhausting that we give up before it even gets to a judge." Sarah exhaled slowly, steadying herself before looking Andy in the eyes. "Then we don't give up," she said. "We fight back." Andy nodded, but inside he was seething. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute anymore. Karen had escalated this into a full-blown legal battle, and whether they liked it or not, they were now deeply entrenched. The next morning, Andy wasted no time reaching out to a real estate attorney. They needed someone who specialized in property law and boundary disputes, someone who could cut through the bureaucratic nonsense and shut Karen down before this dragged on for months or even years. The lawyer they chose, Daniel Harper, came highly recommended, a no-nonsense professional with decades of experience fighting cases exactly like this one. Andy and Sarah sat across from him in his office, the legal notice placed squarely on the desk between them. Harper adjusted his reading glasses and skimmed through the document, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said after a moment, leaning back in his chair, "this is definitely a garbage claim." Andy raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Harper looked up at them. "Meaning she doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. You have full ownership of that section of the lake, your deed is clear, and the property survey confirms it. I've seen people try to pull this kind of stunt before, but unless she has some secret piece of evidence that contradicts all of this, which I highly doubt, she's wasting everyone's time." Sarah let out a breath of relief, but Andy wasn't so easily reassured. "Then why did the court even accept the case?" Harper sighed. "Because the court has to accept it. When someone files a lawsuit, it doesn't matter how ridiculous it is, it still gets processed. The real question is whether she can actually prove anything. And from what I see here, she can't." Sarah frowned. "So what happens now?" Harper folded his hands on the desk. "We file a response. We demand immediate dismissal based on lack of evidence. If the judge has even half a brain, they'll see through this and throw it out." Andy nodded slowly. "And if they don't?" Harper hesitated, and that brief pause sent a ripple of unease through Andy's chest. "Then it goes to trial," the lawyer admitted. "But that's worst-case scenario. More likely we'll be able to bury this before it gets that far." Andy exhaled sharply. "Okay, do whatever you have to do." Harper nodded and began drafting their official response, but Andy couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen wouldn't go down this easily. She had made too many moves, played this game too well. She wasn't just some bitter old woman throwing a tantrum, she was calculated, strategic. And if this was her opening move, Andy couldn't even begin to imagine what she had planned next. The answer came just 3 days later. It was early morning when Sarah stepped outside to grab the newspaper and stopped dead in her tracks. Lined up along the entire edge of their shoreline were dozens of freshly planted stakes, each one marked with bright red flags. Andy heard her sharp intake of breath and rushed to the door. The sight made his stomach drop. Their lake was now littered with survey markers. Karen had called in her own surveyors. Andy stormed down to the water's edge, fury tightening his muscles. The wooden stakes were hammered deep into the ground, forming a clear line cutting right through the property. Each one bore official-looking tags, as if trying to legitimize her false claim. Sarah followed closely behind, her face pale. "What the hell is this?" Before Andy could respond, a voice called out from across the shore. "I told you," Karen said smoothly, standing on her deck with an infuriatingly smug expression. "You've been trespassing." Andy clenched his jaw. "You have no legal right to this land," he shot back. Karen shrugged. "That's what we're going to find out, isn't it?" Andy's hands balled into fists. "This is harassment." Karen simply smiled. "No, Mr. Miller. This is due process." Andy wanted nothing more than to storm across the lake and rip every single one of those markers out of the ground, but he knew that was exactly what she wanted. If he so much as touched a single one, she'd claim destruction of property and add another lawsuit to the pile. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "We don't play into her hands." Andy took a deep breath, forcing himself to step back. He turned on his heel and marched back toward the house. Sarah followed, her voice low and tense. "What now?" "We call Harper," Andy said. "Right now." Harper didn't waste any time. Within hours, he had filed a formal complaint against Karen for unauthorized surveying on private property. He assured them that, legally, her surveyors had no authority to conduct work on land they didn't own. But Karen was one step ahead. The next day, a town inspector arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, claiming he had received reports of unpermitted modifications to the shoreline. Sarah nearly laughed. "Are you serious?" The inspector gave a stiff nod. "We have to investigate all complaints." Andy crossed his arms. "This is retaliation. You realize that, right?" The inspector didn't answer. Sarah gritted her teeth. "Fine. Look around. You'll find nothing." The inspector spent nearly an hour walking the property, taking notes, measuring distances, and making a show of checking every little detail. Finally, he handed them a written warning, stating that if any unapproved alterations were found in the future, they would be fined accordingly. Sarah snatched the paper from his hands. "Unbelievable," she muttered as he walked away. Andy rubbed his temples. "She's trying to bury us in paperwork." Sarah nodded grimly. "And it's working." But Karen wasn't done yet. That night, as Andy stepped outside to check the dock, he froze in place. Floating in the lake, barely visible in the moonlight, was a single wooden sign. Andy waded into the water, pulling it closer. His stomach twisted as he read the words, painted in large, deliberate letters, "Private property trespassers will be prosecuted." His grip tightened around the wood, his knuckles white. Karen wasn't just playing games anymore. She was declaring war. Andy stood on the shore, gripping the wooden sign so tightly that the edges of the board dug into his fingers. The ink on the letters was still fresh, the paint barely dry, as if Karen had been so eager to stake her claim that she hadn't even waited for the night to pass before tossing it into the water. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm, even as every instinct screamed at him to march over to her property and throw the damn thing straight through her front window. But that's what she wanted, an emotional reaction, something she could twist and use against them. She was playing a long, strategic game, and every move was designed to push them closer to the edge, forcing them into a mistake that would cost them more than just money or time. Sarah stepped outside and immediately noticed the way Andy was standing stiff, tense, his shoulders squared in that way that told her he was barely holding back. When she saw the sign, her stomach twisted. She's escalating again. Andy didn't look at her, his eyes still fixed on the dark water where the sign had drifted before he pulled it out. She's not going to stop. She's throwing everything at us, hoping something will stick. Sarah crossed her arms, her mind already working through the possibilities. We need to hit back harder. The next morning, they sat across from Daniel Harper in his downtown office, the tension between them palpable. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he listened to everything that had happened over the past few days. "Let me get this straight," he said finally, flipping through the stack of complaints, legal notices, and boundary dispute filings that Karen had managed to pile onto them in such a short period. She's using an old surveyor to try and fabricate evidence. She's filing zoning complaints with the town. She's planting signs in the lake. And now she's roping in the county inspectors? Andy nodded, his jaw tight. She's not trying to win in court. She's trying to make our lives so miserable that we'll fold before it ever gets that far. Harper exhaled sharply. This isn't just about property. She's using every loophole she can find. She's trying to build a pattern, a history of complaints, legal actions, and disputes so that when this finally lands in front of a judge, she can say, "Look at how much trouble this property has caused." Clearly, there's a legitimate reason to re-evaluate the boundaries. Sarah's grip tightened around her coffee cup. "And that works?" Harper shrugged. "It shouldn't, but in the real world, judges are human. If they see a long paper trail of conflicts, they might hesitate, even if the facts are on your side." Andy ran a hand down his face. "So what do we do?" Harper set his pen down and leaned forward. "We go on offense. So far, we've been reacting to her moves, playing defense, filing responses. That stops now. We're filing our own suit, harassment, malicious legal action, and fraudulent boundary claims. We're going to request an emergency hearing to shut this down before it gets worse." Sarah nodded firmly. "How soon can we do it?" Harper smiled for the first time that morning. "I already started drafting the paperwork." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal preparation. Harper worked fast, gathering every piece of documentation. They had title deeds, tax records, historical surveys, signed statements from previous owners, all ironclad proof that Karen had no claim to the lake. Meanwhile, Andy and Sarah reached out to neighbors, quietly gathering support. Some were reluctant, not wanting to get involved, but others, particularly the older residents, were more than willing to back them up. "That woman's been pushing people around for decades," one neighbor muttered as he signed a statement. "About time someone stood up to her." But Karen wasn't backing down. The day after Harper officially filed their countersuit, a construction crew showed up at the lake. Andy was outside chopping wood when he heard the rumble of heavy machinery. He turned just in time to see a bulldozer pulling onto the narrow dirt road leading toward the water, followed by a work truck carrying concrete barriers. His stomach dropped. Oh, hell no. He dropped the axe and started toward the road just as Sarah ran out of the house, eyes wide. "What's going on?" The foreman hopped out of the truck, a clipboard in hand, and barely spared them a glance before barking orders at his crew. Andy reached him just as the first worker began unloading a barrier. "Hey, stop! What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man barely looked up. "Installing a shoreline stabilization system. Got the permits right here." Sarah grabbed the papers from his hands, her eyes scanning the document. "These permits aren't valid," she snapped. "This is our property. Who hired you?" "Client's name is Karen Doyle." Andy clenched his fists. "Of course it is." The foreman sighed, finally looking at them. "Look, I don't care about your dispute. I've got a contract, I've got orders, and I've got a deadline. If you've got a problem, take it up with whoever issued the permit." Andy took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice even. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." Within an hour, Harper was on the phone with the county permit office, demanding answers. The official on the other end sounded nervous. "We were told the shoreline was under review for public access zoning." Harper's voice went cold. "By who?" A long pause. Mrs. Doyle's legal representative. Andy could feel the blood draining from his face. What the hell does that mean? Harper was already clicking away on his keyboard. It means she's not just fighting this in court anymore. She's trying to get the county to reclassify the land before we can stop her. Sarah's breath hitched. Can she do that? Harper's expression darkened. Not legally. But if she convinces the right people? If she gets just one county official to push it through quietly? By the time we fight it, the change could already be in place. Andy had never felt such pure rage in his life. Karen wasn't just trying to make their lives miserable, she was trying to erase their ownership altogether. Sarah grabbed his arm. So what do we do? Harper took a deep breath. We need to stop the permits immediately. I'll file an injunction, but you need to document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps if this gets in front of a judge. We need undeniable proof that she's trying to pull something illegal. Andy nodded sharply. Consider it done. For the rest of the day, he and Sarah recorded every single detail. They took photos of the construction crew, the unapproved barriers, the survey markers still littering the shore. They collected signed statements from neighbors who had seen Karen making phone calls to local officials. By the time night fell, they had built a mountain of evidence. Harper filed the emergency injunction before sunrise. By noon, the county permit office had revoked Karen's permits. And by the next evening, Karen showed up at their house, seething with fury. Andy opened the door just as she raised a shaking finger at him. You think this is over? She hissed. Andy met her gaze without a hint of hesitation. No, he said. I think you just lost. Karen's lips curled into a snarl, but before she could respond, Harper stepped into view behind Andy, a thick file in his hands. You should know, he said coolly. We're filing for damages. I hope you're ready. For the first time, Karen hesitated, and in that moment, Andy saw it. Doubt. For the first time since this started, she wasn't so sure she could win. Andy barely slept that night, his mind racing through every possible move Karen might make next. He had expected her to retaliate after losing the permit battle, but seeing that flicker of doubt in her eyes had been the first real indication that she was starting to feel the pressure. Still, a woman like Karen wouldn't back down easily. She had spent too many years getting her way, using intimidation and manipulation to bend people to her will. And now, with everything slipping through her fingers, she was bound to lash out harder than ever. The next morning, Andy was up before dawn, pacing the length of the dock with his phone in hand. Sarah emerged from the house, wrapped in a sweater, her expression weary but determined. Did you sleep at all? She asked. Not really, Andy admitted. Harper wants to push forward with the lawsuit immediately. He says we have enough to argue harassment and fraudulent legal action, but we need to keep gathering proof. Sarah nodded, rubbing her arms against the morning chill. Then we keep going, whatever it takes. An hour later, as they were finishing their coffee on the porch, Andy's phone buzzed with a message from their neighbor, Tom Weston. You guys need to see this. Check your driveway. Andy and Sarah exchanged a glance before heading out front. The moment they stepped onto the gravel, Sarah let out a sharp breath. Spray painted across the road in bold, angry letters were the words, liars, frauds, thieves. Andy clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he scanned the area. There were no cameras facing the road, no way to know who had done it, but they didn't need proof to guess. Karen was escalating again, turning this into something bigger, something uglier. Sarah exhaled slowly. She's trying to provoke us. She wants us to react. Andy's mind was already moving past the anger, straight into strategy. We document it, call the sheriff, and file a report. Then we get cameras up by the road. If she's going to play dirty, we're going to catch her in the act. Sarah pulled out her phone, snapping photos from every angle while Andy called the sheriff's department. An officer arrived within 30 minutes, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a tired expression. He introduced himself as Deputy Mark Holloway and surveyed the damage with a frown. "You have any idea who might have done this?" he asked. Andy let out a dry laugh. "Take a wild guess." Holloway sighed. "Yeah, I figured. Look, I'll file the report, but proving it was her is another story." "You got any cameras?" "Not yet," Andy admitted. "But that's changing today." "Good call," Holloway said. "I'll add extra patrols near your property for now, but my advice? Watch your backs. People like her, when they start losing, they get desperate." Andy nodded, his stomach twisting at the implication. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by law enforcement made it feel more real. By that evening, he had installed 2 additional security cameras, one facing the road, the other overlooking the dock and shoreline. If Karen or anyone else tried anything again, they wouldn't get away with it. But the real battle wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about stopping her before she could do any real damage. The next day, the harassment escalated further. Tom Weston called them early in the morning, his voice laced with concern. "She's been going door to door," he said, "telling people you're trying to take public land, that you forged property records." Andy gritted his teeth. "And people believe that?" Tom sighed. "Some do. You know how small towns work. If someone repeats a lie enough times, people start to accept it as truth." Sarah was already looking up local news contacts on her phone. "Then we need to control the narrative. If she's trying to turn people against us, we need to make sure the facts are out there." Andy exhaled, knowing she was right. "We get ahead of it. We talk to neighbors ourselves, show them the documents, explain the situation." But before they could even start damage control, something worse happened. That afternoon, as Sarah walked down to the shoreline, she noticed something unusual near the water's edge. At first, it looked like a pile of old leaves, tangled with bits of debris, but as she got closer, a sickening realization hit her. It wasn't leaves. It was raw meat covered in a white, powdery substance. Her stomach dropped. Poison. She ran back to the house, shouting for Andy. He bolted down the stairs, his heart pounding as he followed her back to the shoreline. The sight made his blood run cold. Someone Karen had left this here, knowing their dog, Rusty, would find it. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, what if he had gotten to it before we did?" Andy crouched down, carefully pulling out his phone to take pictures. "We call the sheriff." Now, Deputy Holloway arrived within the hour, his expression unreadable as he inspected the scene. "This is serious," he said. "You got a lot of enemies, Mr. Miller?" Andy shook his head. "Just one." Holloway exhaled. "I can take this in for testing, but even if it comes back as poison, unless we catch someone in the act, it's circumstantial. I'd bet my badge Karen's behind this, but proving it is another thing entirely." Sarah crossed her arms, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "So what do we do? Wait until she tries something worse?" Holloway hesitated before meeting her gaze. "You start making noise. You file harassment charges. You go public if you have to. People like her get away with this crap because no one pushes back hard enough." Andy nodded slowly. "Then we push back." They filed another formal complaint, adding the poisoning attempt to their growing legal case. Harper was furious when he heard the news. "She's playing with fire," he said. "The second we get something concrete, I'm making sure she pays for every single thing she's done." But Karen wasn't done yet. That night, just past midnight, their security camera alerts went off. Andy bolted upright in bed, grabbing his phone and pulling up the live feed. His stomach dropped. A dark figure was crouched near the shoreline, tampering with something near the dock. Andy didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight, yanked open the front door, and sprinted toward the water. "Hey!" he shouted. "Get the hell off my property." The figure jerked upright, startled by the sudden noise. For a split second, Andy locked eyes with them. It wasn't Karen. It was a younger man, late 20s, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. Andy barely had time to register the details before the man took off running toward the woods. Andy chased him, but the intruder was fast, disappearing into the dense tree line before Andy could close the distance. Panting, Andy turned back toward the dock and immediately saw what the man had been doing. The ropes securing their canoe had been cut clean through, the boat now floating aimlessly in the lake. Nearby, the bolts on the dock ladder had been partially unscrewed, just enough that anyone stepping onto it would send it collapsing into the water. Andy's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called the sheriff. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was sabotage. And the worst part? If Karen had someone else doing her dirty work, it meant she was getting more reckless, more desperate. Which meant things were about to get even worse. Andy barely felt the cold night air as he stood by the dock, staring at the mess the intruder had left behind. His mind was racing, his pulse hammering in his ears as he replayed the brief moment when their eyes had locked. That wasn't just some random vandal. That man had a purpose. He had been sent. And Andy didn't have to guess who had given the order. By the time Deputy Holloway arrived, Andy had already secured the loose bolts on the dock and retrieved the canoe before it could drift too far. Holloway shone his flashlight over the area, muttering under his breath. "She's not even trying to be subtle anymore." He turned to Andy. "You sure you didn't recognize him?" Andy shook his head. "Never seen him before. But I know who he was working for." Holloway let out a long breath. "Look, I'm going to file this as criminal trespassing and attempted property damage, but without an ID, it's going to be tough proving who sent him." Sarah, who had been standing with her arms tightly crossed over her chest, finally spoke. "How many more warnings do you need before you arrest her?" Her voice was steady, but Andy could see the tension in her clenched fists, the barely restrained fury in her eyes. "She sent someone to sabotage our dock. She left poisoned meat on our land. What's next? Do we have to wait until she does something that actually hurts someone?" Holloway didn't answer right away. He looked tired, frustrated, as if he hated the situation as much as they did. "We're building a case," he said finally. "You have to understand, people like her, they don't leave direct evidence. They work through loopholes, technicalities. We need to catch her making a mistake." Andy exhaled sharply. "And if she doesn't," Holloway met his gaze, "then you make her." The words hung between them for a long moment, sinking into Andy's bones. He had spent weeks trying to fight this battle the right way through legal channels, through patience, through logic. But Karen wasn't playing by those rules. She was using every dirty trick in the book, pushing boundaries, testing limits, seeing how much she could get away with before they finally broke. And now Andy realized it was time to break her instead. The next morning, he and Sarah met with Harper at his office, laying out everything that had happened the night before. The lawyer listened carefully, flipping through the growing pile of reports, photos, and statements before finally setting the folder down and rubbing his temples. "All right," he said. "We're done playing nice." Sarah leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Harper tapped the folder. "We hit her from every angle. We escalate. We don't just file another complaint, we request a restraining order. We take all of this and go to the county prosecutor. We push for criminal charges, harassment, property damage, the attempted harm to your dog. We make this a public record so that anyone looking into her sees what kind of person she really is." Andy felt a slow, burning satisfaction rise in his chest. "And if she fights back?" Harper smirked. "Then she walks straight into a trap." The next 48 hours were a blitz of legal warfare. Harper filed the emergency restraining order and sent formal demands to local officials, demanding an immediate halt to any further land disputes initiated by Karen. Meanwhile, Andy and Sarah made sure every neighbor, town official, and law enforcement officer knew exactly what Karen had done. And then, finally, Karen made her fatal mistake. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the air was crisp and the lake reflected the heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Andy and Sarah were outside, reinforcing their property markers with freshly printed legal notices, stating their undisputed ownership of the shoreline, when Karen appeared at the edge of the water. She wasn't alone. Two men stood beside her, both dressed in dark jackets, their expressions cold and unreadable. One of them was the man Andy had seen by the dock that night. Andy felt Sarah tense beside him, but he put a hand on her arm. Not yet. Karen folded her arms, her lips curling into a tight, triumphant smirk. I see you've been busy. Andy straightened, keeping his voice calm. Not as busy as you, apparently. He let his eyes flicker to the two men. Care to introduce your friends? Karen didn't even try to pretend. I don't think that's necessary. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the damp earth. You've made a lot of noise, Andy. You've been stirring up trouble, filing complaints, making accusations. That's not how things work around here. Andy felt the weight of her words settle like a lead weight in his chest. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate them, she was threatening them outright. Sarah, however, had had enough. She stepped forward before Andy could stop her, her voice sharp as a blade. We know what you did. We know about the forged documents, the fake surveys, the bribed officials. And now, thanks to you bringing your little friends here, we have even more evidence of your harassment. Karen's expression flickered, just for a second. Andy smirked. That's right. Cameras. He nodded toward the house, where a new set of security cameras had been installed just that morning. Everything you just said? Everything you're doing right now? It's all being recorded. Karen's face darkened. One of the men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be caught on video. The other muttered something under his breath and took a small step back. Karen's control over the situation was crumbling. Andy pressed the advantage. I wonder how the county prosecutor is going to feel when they see this footage. You threatening us, intimidating witnesses, hiring people to harass a family with two young kids. He let out a low whistle. That's not just a lawsuit, Karen. That's criminal charges. Karen's face twisted into something ugly, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Sarah crossed her arms. Now, unless you want to explain yourself to a judge, I'd suggest you and your goons get off our property. Now? For a long moment, Karen didn't move. The tension was thick, the kind that could snap at any second. But then finally she turned on her heel and stormed away, her so-called associates following closely behind. As soon as she was gone, Sarah let out a shaky breath. Tell me that camera was on. Andy grinned, pulling out his phone and tapping the screen. Oh, it was on. And it caught everything. The next morning, Harper delivered the footage directly to the county prosecutor. By the end of the week, Karen Doyle was officially under investigation for criminal harassment, intimidation, and attempted fraud. And for the first time since this all started, Andy and Sarah felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The days that followed Karen's final confrontation felt surreal. Andy and Sarah had spent so long fighting her, countering every move, anticipating every underhanded trick, that it was hard to believe it was finally coming to an end. But the moment the county prosecutor officially launched an investigation, everything shifted. The power Karen had wielded for so many years, the intimidation tactics, the whispered threats, the backroom deals, it all crumbled under the weight of hard evidence. And the best part? She knew it. The town that had once turned a blind eye to her manipulations was now watching her fall apart. News of the footage spread fast, neighbors talked. Rumors grew, and soon even those who had once supported Karen distanced themselves. People weren't just whispering about her anymore. They were openly avoiding her, some even calling in their own complaints, sharing stories of how she had bullied them over the years. Andy could see the difference immediately. The usual glares Karen had reserved for them whenever she passed by were gone, replaced by something far more satisfying, quiet desperation. She no longer marched around town with her head held high, no longer issued thinly veiled threats disguised as polite conversation. Instead, she was on edge, waiting for the inevitable consequences. Harper kept them updated as the investigation progressed. They're digging deep, he told Andy over the phone. Apparently, this isn't the first time she's pulled something like this. They found discrepancies in some old land transactions, and let's just say she might have bigger problems than just your case. That was an understatement. As it turned out, Karen had been involved in several questionable property disputes over the years, using intimidation and false claims to push people out of land she wanted control over. But until now, no one had ever stood up to her long enough to bring real consequences. The Millers changed that. The official restraining order was granted within days. Karen was legally barred from stepping foot near their property, speaking to them, or engaging in any further legal action against them without facing criminal charges. When Sarah read the final document, she let out a slow, satisfied breath. She can't touch us anymore. And then, just when they thought the dust had settled, the final blow landed. It started with a for sale sign. Andy was outside stacking firewood when he noticed it bold, red, unmistakable, planted right in front of Karen's house. For a long moment, he just stood there staring. Then, without a word, he walked back inside and called Sarah to the window. She followed his gaze, her lips parting in surprise before curling into a slow, incredulous smile. "She's selling the house." Andy nodded. "She's running." And that's exactly what she was doing. Within a week, Karen's house was officially listed on the market, her once pristine lawn overgrown, the perfect image of control she had cultivated for years now shattered. She didn't talk to anyone in town. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply disappeared, her downfall playing out in real time for everyone to see. The legal case against her moved forward, but Andy and Sarah no longer had to lift a finger. The county prosecutor had everything they needed, and soon Karen wasn't just dealing with them, she was facing the system she had spent years manipulating. And for the first time since they moved to the lake house, Andy and Sarah felt free. That first evening after Karen left, Andy took Jake and Sophie down to the water. The kids had been cautious about playing outside ever since the conflict escalated, their joy slowly chipped away by months of uncertainty. But now they could be kids again. Jake skipped a rock across the lake, grinning when it bounced 3 times before sinking. Sophie waded into the shallows, giggling as the water lapped at her ankles. Andy sat on the dock, watching them, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Sarah joined him, sitting beside him, leaning against his shoulder. "We did it," she said softly. Andy smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah," he murmured. "We did. The battle had been long, exhausting, and at times overwhelming. But in the end, they hadn't just won, they had taken back their lives." And as the sun set over their lake, casting golden light over the water, they knew one thing for certain. Karen Doyle was gone, and she was never coming back.